The Unmarked by Matt Fleagle. Chapter 11. Amber's House. Between dreams, Kaleb grew faintly aware of the shrill sound of a girl's scream. The scream echoed through the dark woods around him. "Glista?" he muttered, his eyes blinking open. It was night. Sitting up on the hard dirt, Kaleb saw that Teva was no longer asleep on the patch of earth beside him. What is more, his axe had disappeared. Another scream shook the trees. Kaleb rose hastily and rubbed the sleep from his eyes before crashing through the damp brush at the edge of the clearing. He chased the distant voice as it pierced the air. It was not Glista's, but it sounded familiar nonetheless. For some time, Kaleb staggered forward between shadowy trees, listening for the sound of the voice again. After hearing nothing but the brush of leaves and clacking of branches for a few minutes, he slowed his pace and doubled over to catch his breath. Having set out on his own in pursuit of the voice, it now dawned on Kaleb that he was entirely lost in these woods. He shuddered. Without Teva's nose, Kaleb would never find Ablarin, nor could he safely navigate back to Terrashine in order to seek reinforcements for their scattered party. Worst of all, without his axe, Kaleb had nothing to defend himself if he encountered more Stonerenders. Suddenly, the sounds of men shouting at each other somewhere in the distance broke in on Kaleb's thoughts. Swallowing hard, he followed the shouts through the dense woods. As he stumbled along, Glista and Grimwit's abductions kept replaying in Kaleb's mind. Was he racing into a second trap? And had the Stonerenders already gotten to Teva? By the loudness of the shouts, Kaleb could tell he was not far from the source of the commotion. Then he noticed a clearing in the woods ahead and saw what looked like people shuffling around inside of it. Panting hard, Kaleb came to a stop and dropped down behind a tall shrub. He peered through the shrub and the trees behind it to get a glimpse of the people to whom the voices belonged. Though breathing hard, Kaleb's mind flashed back to Teva's calm voice and direction when his party came under attack at the stream. He had learned a valuable lesson from Teva about steeling one's nerves in the face of imminent danger. Between the overlapping limbs and broad leaves, Kaleb tried to make out what was happening in the grove of trees ahead. From this position he could see little, but could hear well enough to make out most of the words being shouted across the narrow clearing. "Did it bite you?" one said. "Almost," another said. "What was it holding in its mouth?" said a third voice. "Some kind of weapon, an axe, I think." "And the girl?" "She's with me. Tried to bite me too, the little brat." Kaleb could just make out the outline of a female within the burly arms of the man who had just spoke. Even in the moonlight, for the rain clouds had now cleared, he could see that the girl had blonde hair like his. Kaleb could not make out the men's faces at this distance, but their accents betrayed them as another detachment of Stonerender scouts. "What did she want, Elslin? I've never seen a Dellblood trespass this far into our territory, at least not without permission for Velisden." "Let's ask her." With that, the powerful man removed his hand from the captive's mouth. Kaleb heard the girl spit and shout, "Get your filthy hands off of me!" Elslin threw the girl to the ground. Kaleb almost leaped up from his hiding spot behind the log, for he now recognized the girl's voice. It belonged to Madge Dellblood, the kind girl from his village. "My father and Glenward will be leading a search party of elders out here any moment," she said. "So be careful to keep your hands off of me. I am a woman, and our people don't take kindly to men who mishandle women." The Stonerenders laughed. "Woman or not, how will your people find you in these woods? They'll never find their way through these thickets, that is, without one of us Stonerenders guiding them. Only an animal could track us back to Ablarin." "Speaking of animals, where did that wolf go?" said another of the scouts. "I don't know," said the Stonerender who had spoken first when Kaleb arrived. I think the brute was trying to tear open the net we tossed on the girl. He came at it with some kind of axe. You can see a tear in the net here." The man pointed toward the ground where the torn net must have been lying. "But the beast took off into that thicket to the east, soon as we snatched the girl." Just then 2 more men crashed through the undergrowth, from the direction toward which the stone-render had just gestured. They were panting and dragging something bound by thick ropes. "Elson, we've caught her," huffed one of the stone-renders who broke through the thicket. He and his companion were each holding the heavy cords that bound Teva's neck and forelegs. "She ran right into our trap," said the other one, smugly. "And she's smart enough to know we'll choke her if she tries to struggle." At this he pulled the cords taut around Teva's bristling neck, making her cough and sputter a bit. Despite the captor's assurances, the rest of the stone-renders kept their distance from the wolf. Though restrained, the beautiful black beast held her long snout high. Her fearless blue eyes gleamed back at them. "We'll take her back to Verlisden," Elsland said. "As long as it's dark, we can smuggle these 2 back into the city. I don't want our people alarmed by the sight of foreigners or animals. But imagine the favors we'll be treated to, boys, when Verlisden holds court tomorrow morning and we present these 2 prizes." Kaleb found himself shuddering at the mention of Verlisden, whom he knew nothing of. What he had heard of her made the woman sound ruthless, terrifying. He listened as the 5 stone-renders, having regrouped and secured their victims, clambered over some brush at the western end of the clearing, dragging Madge and Teva along with them. When they had gone, Kaleb slumped to the ground behind the log. He couldn't slow his breathing for several minutes. Terrible thoughts rushed in on him. How could he stand a chance of delivering his friends now? He was entirely alone, untrained, and unarmed. Kaleb waited until the footfalls of the stone-renders vanished in the distance. Then he crawled to his feet and entered the narrow clearing the stone-render scouts had just vacated. The grass had been pressed down into muddy patches where Madge and Teva had struggled against their captors minutes before. Kaleb caught the glint of something metal in a patch of brush near him and ran toward it. Kneeling down, he retrieved his axe. Teva must have dropped it here when she fled the stone-renders, he thought. Turning the mud-stained tool in his hands, he noticed how Teva's strong teeth had left jagged marks in the axe handle. Unconsciously, he ran his fingers along the jagged impressions made by Teva's teeth. Kaleb wondered why he had not heard Teva take the axe and leave their hiding spot. With his imagination, Kaleb began to fill in the missing pieces of the event he had just witnessed. Teva must have heard Madge's cries in the distance before a deeply sleeping Kaleb did. Remembering the stone-render's inescapable nets, the creature seized Kaleb's axe in case she might need to free a captive from them. But in her hurry, Teva had shot off to aid the screaming girl without waking Kaleb. Kaleb looked up. The forest trees towered above him, a dark canopy punctuated by the greenish glow of waning moonlight. He sighed and draped his arm over a nearby stump. The coolness after the rains left a mist that hovered over the forest floor and obscured Kaleb's feet. For some time, Kaleb sat and watched the thick mist collect among the trees. It swelled into a fog. Kaleb could barely see anything now through the thick mist. Sighing, Kaleb laid his axe at his feet and leaned his chin against his stout chest. The morning dew dampened his sandals. He realized the fog would make tracking his enemies nearly impossible. There was nothing left to do but sit here, alone in the forest, until daylight broke. Just then, a faint whisper, or something very like a whisper, came out of the mist. It sounded soft, like a child cooing when wrapped up in its mother's arms. Yet there was something musical to the sound as well. It wasn't quite human, nor animal. It was like the clattering tilbury tree limbs, the sound they made when the soft Glenwood breeze knocked them against each other. Yet it also had the calm, droning quality of rainwater slapping against metal, a tinny, echoing sound. It was not quite singing and yet not quite talking either, at least not any kind of speech that Kaleb had heard before. Clutching his axe, Kaleb pulled himself to his feet. As if by a strange compulsion he couldn't explain, the Dellblood found himself following the strange song deeper into the forest. The voice echoed in such a manner that he had no doubt what direction he must turn next to remain just behind it. The musical whisper led Kaleb into the trampled clearing where Madge had been seized, then into the woods veering northward. For hundreds of yards, Kaleb staggered forward, clambering over tangled brush and ducking to avoid low-hanging branches that were concealed almost entirely by the mist. Finally, he found himself standing within the tallest cluster of trees he had yet seen in these woods between Terrashine and Ablerin. Here the sound of the voice disappeared suddenly, with barely an echo in the vast forest surrounding him. Through the floating mists, Kaleb could make out the gigantic treetops rising above him. For a moment, he leaned against one of the massive trunks to catch his breath. Without realizing it, Kaleb had broken into a jog while following the whisper through the forest. He had bruised up his shins against fallen branches as he rushed through the woods, yet hadn't noticed the pain of the bruises until just now. After catching his breath, Kaleb noticed that the mist, which carried a faintly sweet odor, like the scent of flowers after a rain, was beginning to clear out of the forest. He could now make out his surroundings much better. Then he noticed something out of place in the wide grove of trees where he stood. For ahead of him, farther into the broad grove, stood a small shack. The faint glimmer of candlelight, backlit the curtains, hung against its tiny, unevenly shaped windows. Though Kaleb could no longer hear the musical whisper, he felt that the noise through the mist had certainly led him here, to this exact place. He sensed, without knowing quite why, that this sheltered glen was the exact spot he was meant to be. Moreover, the crude shack, though a paltry sign of civilization, made him feel less alone somehow. Taking a few steps closer to the ramshackle house, Kaleb heard a low hum of human voices conversing inside. He crept to the closest window, pressing his feet lightly in the dirt to conceal any sound of his approach, and pushed his ear against the shack's walls. "And is she now gone?" a man was saying inside. "Yes, she left an hour before you arrived," said another voice, a woman's. "Why did she come at night? She never visits you at night." There was a pause. The woman did not answer. "Amber, what is it?" said the first voice. "She came to ask for my counsel. It was not a friendly visit as before." "Your counsel?" "She said a branch had been taken from the Dellblood's sacred tree. She said her people believe a stone render is responsible." "Oh, that's impossible. Our scouts never go near Glenwood Village. We have no business there." "Do you really know that for certain? You are not one of Verlisden's spies, Freylin." "But I am close to the city elders. They have mentioned no campaign against the Dellbloods." "You and I both know that the elders of Ablerin are no longer governing the stone renders," said Amber. "Verlisden has built a loyal network of scouts who hang on her every word. She is quietly turning them into her own private army. You have admitted as much to me before." Freylin became quiet. When he spoke again, Freylin sighed and said, "It is not impossible that she might send a scout to sabotage the Dellblood's tree, but what would be her aim? We Stonerenders do not want war with the Dellbloods." "You do not want it. But Verlisden has consulted dark forces in the highlands to the north. She knows of the magic inside of the Dellblood's sacred tree, and of the magic within your people's great stone. Who's to say she has not divined something cruel and terrible, Freylin, that she has a plan that would give her power over both your people and theirs. You must trust our people, my dear, Freylin replied. We would not go to war against another people without provocation. That would go against the traditions of our ancestors. And you believe that Verliston intends to honor those traditions forever? Freylin grew quiet again. Freylin, my love, said Amber, it is not our separate peoples I worry about. It is our daughter. She is not a Dellblood, at least not fully. Her people know nothing of this. For that matter, they think I am dead too, and that ignorance keeps me alive. But if our people should come to battle, her heritage may be discovered, and the Dellbloods might turn on her as a Stonerender spy. Our daughter is no spy, said Freylin. And I am no villain, said Amber. Yet they cast me out of their midst. The conversation halted. Then Freylin said, I see that you are right about one thing. Any encounter between the Dellbloods and the Stonerenders might lead them to put the pieces together. About her heritage, I mean. It won't be long before they discover that she is a half-breed. Do they know of her second mark? Has she kept her hair long enough to cover it? Kaleb heard Amber say nothing, but assumed by Freylin's response that Amber had nodded. We broke laws, Freylin said quietly. You were a Dellblood, and I a Stonerender. Our love brought into this world a child with a foot inside both worlds. I am no Dellblood, Freylin, not by their laws, Amber replied. I have not carried their mark a day in my life, as you know. My forehead is clean of their blasted curse. She paused, and Kaleb heard a wooden chair creak as though Amber had risen from it. And I have no regrets, the woman continued. My exile brought me here, to this very place, where I fell in love with a good man. It matters not to me what mark you wear on your flesh, Freylin, nor what mark I lack. For you found me wandering alone in these dark woods, and you built a shelter for me. You brought supplies out of your city to bandage my wounds and keep me fed. You swore your protection to me from the scouts patrolling these woods. What is best? You treated me with the same honor in which you hold your own family. Amber stifled a sob, then continued. You may be a Stonerender, my dear Freylin, and I a Dellblood, but our daughter, like each of us, belongs on the line between worlds. Her dark eyes and her sharp jaw reflect your face, and my dark complexion shines in her beautiful skin. Kaleb heard a sound that he interpreted as the Stonerender seating himself in a chair, as Amber went on. I am afraid, Freylin, that her days of traveling to meet me in these woods may be over, if that dreadful Verliston is not stopped. And yet, what do I know, for I belong to no people? At this very moment, Kaleb realized that his right foot had grown numb. He had crouched awkwardly against the outer wall of Amber's dwelling and had tried his best not to move since the eavesdropping began. Now Kaleb slowly shifted his position to regain full balance. He did not, however, notice the small branch half buried in the soil by his feet. The cracking of the twig his foot landed on broke the silence outside the shack. Within moments, Freylin was out of the tiny dwelling, a sword drawn in his fist. Who's there? Kaleb tried to flee, but his numb foot gave out. He collapsed in a heap on the hard earth several yards from the shack. Halt, intruder, Freylin hissed. Kaleb found himself staring at the sharp edge of a blade. What business do you have out here in the deep woods of Ablerin? Freylin said. I don't mean you any harm. I'm looking for someone. I think you know her. Her name is Madge, and from what I overheard just now, I believe that she is your daughter. What you overheard, said Freylin. What did you hear, intruder? With this, the scout set his blade against the front of Kaleb's tunic. Its sharp tip pricked Kaleb's chest. Just then Amber emerged from the shack, clutching a shabby cloak tightly around her shoulders. The woman, clearly a Dellblood by her tan complexion, wore gray civilian Stonerender garments, not the tight-fitting black garb worn by the Stonerender scouts. She crossed to where Kaleb lay, pinned to the ground by the sharp end of Freyland's blade. "Be careful, Amber," said Freyland, his sword glistening at its edges under the pale moonlight. "We do not know if he's lying. There are strange things afoot in the forest tonight. He might be a spy sent by the Dellbloods." Freyland's words seemed not to alarm the woman. She squinted down at the log splitter. Then she knelt down beside him to get a closer look at his face. "There is something familiar about this one," she muttered. Reaching out, Amber touched Kaleb's brow with her wrinkled right hand. Kaleb shuddered at the feeling of her leathery skin against his own. "You have no mark, child," she said softly. "A Dellblood with no mark. An unmark, they call you, am I right?" "Do you know him?" Freyland said, cautiously withdrawing his blade. Amber took Kaleb's hand in hers, that is, the hand not clutching his axe, and lifted it up to her forehead. Amber dragged his shaking fingers along her own brow. "We are the same, child," she whispered, and for the first time in many years, Kaleb felt the kind touch of another person. It both warmed and chilled his bones. Kaleb withdrew his hand from Amber's grip, not forcefully, but in order to wipe confused tears from his embarrassed face. "Neither of us belongs with the Dellbloods or with the Stonerenders," Amber said, rising again. "We are nomads, like the ancient beasts banished to these woods." "What is your name?" said Freyland to Kaleb. I'm Kaleb Dellblood," he sputtered through a broken voice. "I was sent by Fallwrinkle to recover a branch stolen from the Dellblood's sacred tree. The Stonerenders took it, and they've kidnapped my companions as well." The woman glanced up at Freyland. "This is the one Madge was looking for." Freyland finally sheathed his sword. He laid his hand on the sword's hilt. "Kaleb," the woman said, "if that is who you are, then I have a sad message for you. My daughter ventured into these woods tonight not to visit me, but to find and warn you." "Warn me of what?" Kaleb said. She looked at Freyland, who nodded at her. "Tell him," he said. "She told me your people have sent out tracking parties to find you. They have come to believe that you are in league with the Stonerenders, that you helped them take the sacred branch. You are now regarded as a traitor, and if they find you, they plan to take you back to Glenward and execute you at once."